Game 42, Brighton versus Burnley on the 9th of December 2023, titled Mind Games. Sometimes I sit and wonder why I do this. It isn't for accolades, I do it for some sort of cathartic reasons, and because my brain never really lets up. It's always churning over some thought or idea. If it's a thought, you can sort of unpick it, go deeper and try and understand it. If it's an idea, my mind tends to assess it and tell me if I like it, then it will let me run away with it, sort of allow me a rush of excitement, as this is the moment. It clearly isn't, but for some period of time I'm locked on this notion being the best thing since sliced bread. The rose-coloured spectacles are on and it's a surefire winner that no one has ever thought of before. It's a bit like thinking in today's day and age that you've invented the wheel, only for you to discover via an almighty anticlimax that you are a twat and you got carried away with the notion without double checking the internet firstly. Maybe that in a nutshell is what my life is all about, looking for the next thing, whether my first millionaire business idea or the next challenge or just something nice. So that is generally why I keep an idle mind busy, because what some people view as nice, I tend to think of being mundane. And why do it if there isn't a product at the end of it? Man, sometimes this is deep shit. I will just tell you now that over the year you'll realise my mind and I are not good bedfellows. Anyway, another normal day on the train, with a seat and a normal busy standing room only carriages by the time I get to London. And the train moving gyrating groins at eye level once again. The groin adjacent to me on this journey, luckily not right next to me, was of a middle-aged man with his flies at half-mast. I didn't need that. I didn't look, but it was in my peripheral vision, which meant craning my neck away from the said flies and then contemplating on telling him that Tiny Tim was tiptoeing through the tulips, and then thinking, no, leave it. But somewhere this peripheral glimpse had embedded on my mind, and because no one can talk to my mind started like an earworm to remind me of the image. I'm not looking, it's my mind that constantly reminds me, all because it is laying fallow or dormant whilst on the train. So it thinks it's funny to busy itself mentally taunting me to tell him. I cannot explain how infuriating this is. It is trying all sorts of games on me, saying, if it was you, wouldn't you want to be told? And because of the way I'm built, you'd be staring if it was a lady. I am now in almost head-shaking territory. Thankfully, everyone is unaware of my inner turmoil and argumentative mind. But if anyone experiences these episodes of mental discussions, often heated by the way, then you'll be aware of the draining aspect of it. The train hits Marylebone and everybody alights. I actually wait for everybody to alight before calling myself a wanker. It doesn't matter to the old mind, it just laughs and waits to dive in on another vision. I know it's there, I live with its shithousery it often provides. One day I will tell you about the trapdoor bogey incident at Stevenage. I arrive in good time at the studios and I'm met by one of the younger commentators. He's a terrific lad. He was in a quandary about his life and where it's going, etc, etc. So we have a chat. Now I try and disarm him by telling him how this old fool got it wrong. But without knowing, all I succeeded in doing was got him worrying about me. The general gist of the chat was me informing him that if he wants to go all in for a life in commentary, he's young enough now, his responsibilities are not massive, i.e. rental is small, mouths to feed are large in terms of responsibilities, and his skill set is all there for him to succeed if he works hard. I remind him of my background, destroyed in primary school by a paedophile teacher which left scars I still cannot get rid of. Lack of self-esteem preyed on at other schools, meaning I bunked off rather than get bullied. Not thick, but not with any other qualifications other than survival. A bricklayer to a commentator, it's been a long road and one I'm continually on the back foot in. Most commentators are journalists and can put commas in the right place, I cannot. Therefore, in discussions, I often sit back and laugh at me, just like they did all those years ago when the paedophile teacher used to destroy me in front of the class, and all because I wouldn't let him do what he wanted. In my life, there is no success, just a life of worrying of being found out for what I am. No one will ever know that, though, as I don't know that myself. Anyway, using my life as a how not to scenario for this chap, I thought I had encouraged him enough that he was good enough, and that the time was right to go for it. The executive producer pulled me a few months later and asked for a chat. Obviously, with the news of the death of our colleague very much to the forefront of our minds and the chat I'd had earlier, he wanted to check if I was okay. This did surprise me a tad, as I thought I was okay, but obviously I must have overdone the sympathy disarming card. One thing everyone should know is I know what I am and I deal with it. I explain all is well, as can be expected, and Brighton Burnley is a good tonic for a depressive commentator. Laugh out loud. In fairness, the game is pretty good, with Burnley taking the lead with a fine strike from Wilson Odobert, whose name always reminds me of something out of a Dickensian novel, before late on in the game Adingra levels it up with a header. Adingra! Great name, but given his full name is Simon, his parents kept his feet firmly on the ground. Simon! Maybe Aloysius would have been better. The train home is the Paddington to Oxford one. Decent seat, table and plug socket. There's a warmth inside the train as we pull away. Darkness outside perforated by lights in windows. A little dread fills my mind. I have promised to get the decorations down tomorrow from the loft. That's a bit like opening a Giles cartoon garden shed. You know, the wonderful cartoonist, he would draw a shed that was rammed with gear, falling out of the door when he opened it. That's a bit like our loft. You have to move one thing to make space, drag another thing into the space before moving another thing to get the next thing closer to the loft hatch. Logistically, it's a nightmare. And all I can think is it won't be long before it goes back in January. Is it worth it? Plus, for all you uninitiated people out there, mine is a trussed loft space, not a cut roof. Now I've lost you. Basically, it's not very high and full of woodwork. So down with the decorations before up with the decorations, before down with the decorations and up with the decorations. It'll all be over before it started. Unlike this journey home. Game 43, Melbourne City versus Zhejiang on the 12th of December 2023, titled Social Clubs. It was an early start for a game in West London, so I drove into London and parked near the studio. I'd booked a driveway and took the Lecky car. By the time I'd reached the said driveway, I was convinced I needed to recharge somewhere before going home. The faff, the stress, the cost and the environment sounds like a book along the lines of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. The angle on this game was pretty simple. Melbourne City, part of the City group of teams around the globe, need to win after slumping in their last two games. But they are at home, and to be fair, the opposition weren't the greatest in my humble opinion. I arrive in plenty of time. No one else is in yet, but I expect Brenner's to arrive shortly. Indeed, after a visit to the little boy's room and on my return, like the dresser in Mr. Ben, Brenner's appears. There is something about Brenner's that I cannot quite put my finger on. He is softly spoken and has a dry sense of humour, but he is always so well mannered, except for when I'm at home and not in the studio. He has that great quality where, when thinking about what I have said, he takes a second to compute before answering, almost like a satellite delay. But it shows a clever man. I couldn't tell you if he likes me or puts up with me and my meandering chats. He works all over the globe, so he must be good at his job. The one thing people have said about me is, now this is in a professional way, not all my other foibles, is that I come in, do and go. Some people think that's a skill, but I was a brickie who worked on job done and home. God, I was a rough bricklayer, but that was because of a lead eye blurred spot and being bored out of my skull. Anyway, today's AFC Fair was a Champions League group game between Melbourne City and Zhejiang. Melbourne are win and through, Zhejiang were in win and miracle territory. So bearing that in mind, Melbourne should be the more determined. Prep and paperwork sorted, internet pages up and notes prepared. Microphone check 1 done, and then the screen flicks up for the first glimpse of today's venue. Prince's Park. Whoa. Hang on there, that's not what I expected. It's one of those wrong venues for football, and for a game of this magnitude, and for the home side, it looks more like a small cricket ground or a small Aussie rules ground. One of those where the football pitch is in the middle and looks lost on the outfield. On camera, all I can see is grass with 2 perspex movable dugouts. The terracing that was visible was a long way away. Creating an enclosed hostile partisan atmosphere wasn't going to happen. Suddenly, I wander off to 2 games in my big banana history or situations. One day in Summertown, Oxford, in Costa, I was ordering a coffee before heading into the studios at Jack FM to do some editing. When to my surprise, on ordering the coffee, the young lad stopped in his tracks and looked at me before asking me another question. What it was I cannot recall, but I answered it. Then a smile broke out over his face and he said to me, "I hate football grounds with a social club in the corner." The penny dropped for me, and I asked if he was an Oxford United fan, as it was a phrase I had used about Fleetwood's ground in a previous commentary. It was a dismal defeat by 4-0, where our keeper at one stage was crawling around like a baby on all fours in our penalty area. And at the time they were very arrogant towards us. I tried very hard to justify my comment, but a social club inside the ground is very non-league. He replied no, he wasn't an Oxford United fan, but he was working in the shop and it was on, and he laughed out loud over the phrase. And at my slightly obvious annoyance at not just being beat, but having heard the Captain Pugwash theme 4 times, and we played shit, not to mention a 3-hour drive home totally pissed off. Why do I mention this? Well, Prince's Park had a similar vibe, and it felt very park footballish. The other big banana game was at Rotherham away. This particular game was played at the Dom Valley Athletics Arena, as Rotherham had left Millmore and the New York Stadium was being built. The Nana boys and all the other press were in the main stand. So between us, remember, we are the eyes of the listener, was the following. At least 30 rows of seats down to the track side. Then we had the pits for the long jump, etc., before 8 lanes of running track, and then the grass before the nearest touchline. I would say in any normal ground, the nearest touchline at the Dom Valley was around about the centre spot on a normal pitch. Then we had the full width of the pitch before the dugouts on the far side. This particular game was late November and the lights were getting dark and the floodlights were athletic floodlights. Plus, add in a misty light fog and anything that happened down the far side of the pitch, from substitutions to incidents, and we were guessing. And before anybody says it, no change there then. As for the away fans, they were in another county. Dissipation of atmosphere was inevitable on the day, and we had a former Rotherham centre-half player for us who was at least 6'6" or more, but when he jumped he was only 5'2". So Prince's Park gave this commentator a little bit of a worry. Visually it's going to look like there's no supporters watching. Live feed from the pitch-side mics are going to be players calling for the ball, and generally not conducive to making it enthralling for the audience. But I was hoping the desire and determination of one of the sides would make it a spectacle where I could enhance the whole experience without having to work my socks off. Would I be right or wrong? Well, it was so dire it hurt. This game with so much riding on it for one side was deader than a dead rubber from Rubbersville. Melbourne City, an Australian side. Aussie's sides fight like tooth and nail, don't they? This side seemed to be doing their nails. It was powder puff stuff. They did have a couple ruled out for offside, and your commentator didn't raise the volume in his commentary because it was all too obvious they were offside. But Melbourne fashioned a chance and Arslan puts them in front. As they say, goals change matches. But for me, Melbourne were always not quite good enough to put the game to bed. I say that having just read the Melbourne report, which must have been written by the manager before going to see the board. What game did this person witness? Because it's not the same one I saw. But with 9 minutes added, Zhejiang got an equaliser, and what emotion the home side had evaporated quicker than a fog on a sunny day. In a way, I could almost hear the coach going large at the players in the change room, but they simply were not good enough on the day. Whether a better crowd and ground would have inspired them remains to be seen. But for now, they are awaiting permutations in the last group games elsewhere. It is midday when I bid adieu to Brenners and sign out. It's been raining and I wander some 50 yards to the driveway in my car. I call my wife to tell her of my planned route home via Heston Services for some charge. She says don't buy anything from the services as we need to pay the mortgage. I sit for an hour at Heston Services while the car charges up and eat and drink any savings on fuel I've made, and arrive home an hour later than I should have. But ecologically and economy-wise, I have helped. I have bought things that have added to my fast disappearing waistline, and on the way home watched thousands of cars, both petrol and diesel, go by, including lorries, vans and other vehicles. I think I'm in for a real battle in trying to save the planet on my own. Oh, and by the way, the steak bake I had from Greg's was so hot, burnt my mouth and left a bit of flapping skin on the roof of my mouth. Life's a bitch. Game 44, John Buck versus Bangkok on the 13th of December 2023. Titled Time Flies By. This is the final time of the year 2023 that I will go to Gravity Studios. Sometimes it doesn't pay to dwell on landmarks that pass, but as you get older you do tend to reflect a little more than you should. At my age, I'm over halfway through my life's deck of cards. I have played a lot more cards than I have left in my pack. But it is a reasonable kick-off time. That meant a more leisurely journey to Gravity. Whilst on the train, I think back to the first time I realised the passing of time. We all know that time ticks on with every second and every breath, but I think it was Boris Becker who really first alerted me to the passing of time. I didn't meet him personally, and he has no recollection of what a memorable thing he did. But I was playing cricket in the outfield at Wantage. It was a nice sunny afternoon. Whilst fielding on the boundary, a nearby house had their doors open and they were watching the men's Wimbledon final, which Boom Boom won. I would have been about 22 at the time, and then some 14 years later he retired. Yeah, you say it, 14 years is a long time, but it passed in an instant. I'd witnessed his whole career. It was at that precise moment that the real passing of time hit me. What had I been doing all of those years? And more importantly, where did they go? Prior to that, people and icons had come to the end of their careers, but I wasn't there at the start of them. One of my favourite lines in a play or story or film was written by Charles Dickens when he wrote, "We're all fellow travellers to the grave." So true. I had been looking out of the train window thinking about the passing of time so much that I had arrived in Marylebone. I tube it to Paddington and off to Goldhawk Road. It is a pleasant day and the walk wasn't pain-free, but it also wasn't a rushed route march either. Now, I love all sorts of architecture and I blame Mr. Frost for that. He once said when we were raggedy-arse bricklaying apprentices that we would start looking at buildings in a different light, and he was right. Buildings once built become defined with their characteristics, which also denote their age in a changing landscape. The intricacies of the facades of old London buildings are really quite nice. Little embellishments which are both ornate and now too costly to build in our own modern buildings. If you are walking through a town or city centre, look above the shop frontages and you will see the lost architectural nuances in today's modern buildings. But in fairness, I have also worked on buildings built by supposed craftsmen who wore shirt and ties whilst laying bricks. But actually they've been built by Bodgett and Scarpa brothers. Here endeth the Construction and Architecture Journal section of this podcast. I make it into Gravity, Brenner's duly tells me where to go, and I settle in for the last group match of the AFC Champions League 2023. There again a year you and I will not see again. Melancholy? No, Mel and Kim spring to mind, and there is someone who would have loved to have seen 2023 and a lot of the years prior to that. Be thankful, moany man. In writing this, I'm not sure if I'm talking to myself and you just happen to be eavesdropping, or I really do succumb to the voice in my head. Jeonbuk versus Bangkok United, who have already qualified. Jeonbuk need to qualify too, so a little at stake. It turns out to be a pleasurable game to commentate on. A 5-goal thriller, and ended with enough nerves for Jeonbuk fans to take their fingernails down to the quick. Bangkok took the lead before Jeonbuk finally equalised before the break. Into the second half, and 2 identical goals saw Jeonbuk home and hosed, didn't it? No. Bangkok got a late goal to make the end of the match tense and nervous. Fair play to Bangkok. They had already qualified and could have rolled over and said tickle my belly, but they didn't. I dish out some cards to Brenners and Christina, faces who I see on a regular basis at Gravity, before ambling down the knee screamer straight in the dusk of this winter's evening. Looking and observing buildings and the people scurrying around the main road, I wonder what is going on in their minds and lives. The tube to Paddington was full and it was getting near rush hour on the trains. I grab a latte before waiting at the top end of Paddington platforms, waiting to see what platform my train home would pop up on. The garden eye exchanged some pleasantries, with me being considerate of him being posted all alone at the Hammersmith and City line end of the platform. It isn't a bad little job, but it is a little lonely for the lad. He chats back and asks where I'm heading whilst I wait for the sign to tell me where to go. He then flicks his card on the card reader, opens the barrier and tells me platform 2 to Oxford. Go on, get on it now before everybody else. I thank him and wobble like a weeble off to the train and grab a seat. Within minutes the train is filled quicker than a blocked drain, but I'm sat down, so thank you, young man. A quick glance up above my head just to check the seat hasn't been pre-booked before reflecting on a day that has just passed again. I've turned another card in my life story pack over and I can't play it again. Sometimes I do wonder why I get so internally angry. Maybe it is because if someone or somebody says you cannot do something, I become determined to do it. Or, in that case, if something's happened that didn't go to plan, I want to redo it. Sadly, life and days past can't be gone back to. I am home and a wee bit tired, but an 8 out of 10 performance still holds at least. I thought I did something rightish for once. Rocco loves me, and I think my wife does too. But I still think I'm a bit of an arse.